Hardtack and Coffee, or The Unwritten Story of Army Life, by John D. Billings. Dedication. To my comrades of the Army of the Potomac, who, it is believed, will find rehearsed in these pages much that has not before appeared in print, and which it is hoped will secure to their children, in a permanent form, valuable information about a soldier's life in detail that has thus far been only partially written. This work is most affectionately dedicated by their friend, the author. Preface. During the summer of 1881, I was a sojourner for a few weeks at a popular hotel in the White Mountains. Among the 200 or more guests who were enjoying its retirement and good cheer were from 12 to 20 lads, varying in age from 10 to 15. When tea had been disposed of, and darkness had put an end to their daily romp and hurrah without, they were wont to take in charge a gentleman from Chicago, formerly a gallant soldier in the Army of the Cumberland, and, in a quiet corner of the spacious hotel parlor, or a remote part of the piazza, would listen with eager attention as he related chapters of his personal experience in the Civil War. Less than 2 days elapsed before they pried out of the writer the acknowledgment that he too had served Uncle Sam, and immediately followed up this bit of information by requesting me to alternate evenings with the veteran from the West, and entertaining them with stories of the war as I saw it. I assented to the plan readily enough, and a more interested or interesting audience of its size could not be desired than the knot of boys who clustered around us on alternate nights, while we related to them in an offhand way many facts regarded as too commonplace for the general histories of the war. This trifling piece of personal experience led to the preparation of these sketches, and will largely account for the didactic manner in which they are written. They are far from complete. Many topics of interest are left untreated. They will readily suggest themselves to veterans, but it was thought best not to expand this volume beyond its present proportions. It is believed that what is herein written will appeal largely to a common experience among soldiers, and full faith that such is the case. They are now presented to veterans, their children, and the public as an important contribution of warp to the more majestic woof which comprises the history of the great Civil War already written. That history to date is a history of battles, of campaign, and of generals. This is the first attempt to record comprehensively Army life in detail, in which both text and illustrations aim to permanently record information which the history of no other war has preserved with equal accuracy and completeness. I am under obligations to many veterans for kindly suggestions and criticisms during the progress of this work, to Houghton and Mifflin for the use of Holmes' Sweet Little Man, and especially to Comrade Charles W. Reed for his many truthful and spirited illustrations. The large number of sketches which he brought from the field in 1865 has enabled him to reproduce with telling effect many sights and scenes once very familiar to the veterans of the Union armies, which cannot fail to recall stirring experiences in their soldier's life. Believing they will do this, and that these pages will appeal to a large number to whom the Civil War is yet something more than a myth, they are confidently, thus forth, the pleasant labor of spare hours, with no claim for their literary excellence, but with the full assurance that they will partially meet a want hitherto unsupplied. Cambridgeport, Massachusetts, March 30th, 1887. Chapter 1. The Tocsin of War. A score of millions hear the cry, and herald it abroad. To arms they fly to do or die, for liberty and God. E. P. Dyer. And yet they keep gathering and marching away, as the nation turned soldier, and all in a day. There's the father and son, while the miller takes gun, with the dust of the wheat still whitening his hair. Pray, Where are they going with this martial air? F. E. Brooks. On the 6th of November, 1860, Abraham Lincoln, the candidate of the Republican Party, was elected President of the United States, over 3 opponents. The autumn of that year witnessed the most exciting political canvass this country had ever seen. The Democratic Party, which had been in power for several years in succession, split into factions and nominated 2 candidates. The Northern Democrats nominated Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, who was an advocate of the doctrine of squatter sovereignty. That is, the right of the people living in a territory, which wanted admission into the Union as a state, to decide for themselves whether they would or would not have slavery. The Southern Democrats nominated John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, at the time Vice President of the United States. The doctrine which he and his party advocated was the right to carry their slaves into every state and territory in the Union without any hindrance whatever. Then there was still another party, called by some the Peace Party, which pointed to the Constitution of the country as its guide, but had nothing to say on the great question of slavery, which was so prominent with the other parties. It took for its standard-bearer John Bell of Tennessee, and Edward Everett of Massachusetts was nominated as vice president. This party drew its membership from both of the others, but largely from the Democrats. Owing to these divisions, the Republican Party, which had not been in existence many years, was enabled to elect its candidate. The Republicans did not intend to meddle with slavery where it then was, but opposed its extension into any new states and territories. This latter fact was very well known to the slaveholders, and so they voted almost solidly for John C. Breckinridge. But it was very evident to them, after the Democratic Party divided, that the Republicans would succeed, and so, long before the election actually took place, they began to make threats of seceding from the Union if Lincoln was elected. Freedom of speech was not tolerated in these states, and Northern people who were down south for business or pleasure, if they expressed opinions in opposition to the popular political sentiments of that section, were at once warned to leave. Hundreds came north immediately to seek personal safety, often leaving possessions of great value behind them. Even native Southerners, who believed thoroughly in the Union, and there were hundreds of such, were not allowed to say so. This class of people suffered great indignities during the war on account of their loyalty to the old flag. Many of them were driven by insult and abuse to take up arms for a cause with which they did not sympathize, deserting it at the earliest opportunity, while others held out to the bitter end, or sought a refuge from such persecution in the Union lines. As early as the 25th of October, several Southerners who were, or had been prominent in politics met in South Carolina, and decided by unanimous vote that the state should withdraw from the Union in the event of Lincoln's election, which they seemed almost certain. Some other states held similar meetings about the same date. Thus early did the traitor leaders prepare the South for disunion. These men were better known at the time as fire eaters. As soon as Lincoln's election was announced, without waiting to see what his policy towards the slave states were going to be, the impetuous leaders at the South addressed themselves at once to the carrying out of their dreams, and South Carolina followed, at intervals more or less brief, by Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Florida, and Texas, seceded from the Union and organized what was known as the Southern Confederacy. Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, and Tennessee seceded later. The people at the North stood amazed at the rapidity with which treason against the government was spreading, and the loyal Union-loving men began to inquire where President Buchanan was at this time, whose duty it was to see that all such uprisings were crushed out. And, "Oh, for 1 hour of Andrew Jackson in the president's chair," was the common exclamation, because that decided and unyielding soldier president had so promptly stamped out threatened rebellion in South Carolina when she had refused to allow the duties to be collected at Charleston. But that outbreak in its proportions was to this one as an infant to a giant, and it is quite doubtful if Old Hickory himself, with his promptness to act in an emergency, could have stayed the angry billows of rebellion which seemed just ready to break over the nation. But at any rate, he would have attempted it, even if he had gone down in the fight. At least so thought the people. The very opposite of such a president was James Buchanan, who seemed anxious only for his term of office to expire, making little effort to save the country, nor even willing, at first, that others should do so. With a traitor for his Secretary of War, the South had been well supplied with arms under the very nose of the old man. With a traitor for his Secretary of Navy, our vessels, not many in number, it is true, had been sent into foreign waters, where they could not be immediately recalled. With a traitor as Secretary of the Treasury, the public treasury had been emptied. Then, too, there began the seizure of arsenals, mints, custom houses, post offices, and fortifications within the limits of the seceding states, and still the president did nothing. Or worse than nothing, claiming that the South was wrong in its acts, but that he had no right to prevent treason and secession, or, in the phraseology of that day, no right to coerce a sovereign state. And so at last he left the office a disgraced old man, for whom few had or have a kind word to offer. Such, briefly, was the condition of affairs when Abraham Lincoln, fearful of his life, which had been threatened, entered Washington under cover of darkness, and quietly assumed the duties of his office. Never before were the people of this country in such a state of excitement. At the North, there were a large number who boldly denounced the long-heeled abolitionists and black Republicans for having stirred up this trouble. I was not a voter at the time of Lincoln's election, but I had taken an active part in the torchlight parades of the Wide-Awakes and Rail-Splitters, as the political clubs of the Republicans were called, and so came in for a share of the abuse showered upon the followers of the new president. As fresh deeds of violence or new aggressions against the government were reported from the daily papers in the shop where I was then employed, someone who was not a Lincolnite would exclaim in an angry tone, "I hope you fellows are satisfied now. I don't blame the South an atom. They have been driven to desperation by such lunatics as Garrison and Phillips, and these men ought to be hung for it. If there is a war, I hope you and every other black Republican will be made to go and fight for the N all you want to. You like the N so well you'll marry one of them yet. And I want to see those hot-headed abolitionists put into the front rank and shot first." These are mild quotations from the daily conversations had not only where I was employed, but in every other shop and factory in the North. Such wordy contests were by no means one-sided affairs, for the assailed, while not anxious for war, were not afraid of it, and were amply supplied with arguments with which they answered and enraged their antagonists. And if they did not always silence them, they drove them into making such ridiculous remarks as the foregoing. If I were asked who these men were, I should not call them by name. They were my neighbors and my friends. But they are changed men today. There is not one of them who, in the light of later experiences, is not heartily ashamed of his attitude at that time. Many of them afterwards went to the field, and, sad to say, are there yet. But this was the period of the most intemperate and abusive language. Those who sympathized with the South were, some months later, called Copperheads. Lincoln and his party were reviled by these men without any restraint except such as personal shame and self-respect might impose, and these qualities were conspicuously absent. Nothing was too harsh to utter against Republicans. No fate was too evil for their political opponents to wish them. Of course, all of these revilers were not sincere in their ill wishes, but the effect of their utterances on the community was just as evil, and the situation of the new president, at its best a perplexing and critical one, was thus made all the harder, by leading him to believe that a multitude of the citizens of the North would obstruct instead of supporting him. It also gave the slaveholders the impression that a very considerable number of Northern men were ready to aid them in prosecuting their treasonable schemes. But now, the rapid march of events wrought a change in the opinions of the people in both sections. The leading abolitionists had argued that the South was too cowardly to fight for slavery, and that the South had been told by the Fire Eaters and its Northern friends that the North could not be kicked into fighting. That in case war should arise, she mould have her hands full and keep her enemies at home in check. Alas, how little did either party understand the temper of the other. How much like that story of the two Irishmen, meeting one day in the army, and one says, "How are you, Mike?" "How are you, Pat?" says the other. "But my name is not Pat," said the first speaker. "Neither is mine Mike," said the second. "Fikes then," said the first. "It must be neither of us." Nothing could better illustrate the attitude of the North and South towards each other than this anecdote. Nothing could have been more perfect than this mutual misunderstanding each displayed of the temper of the other, as the stride of events soon showed. The story of how Major Anderson removed his little band of United States troops from Fort Moultrie to Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, for reasons of greater safety, is a familiar one. Likewise, how the rebels fired upon a vessel sent by the President with supplies intended for it, and finally, after a severe bombardment of several days, how they compelled the fort to surrender. It was these events which opened the eyes of the Northern dough-faces, as those who sympathized with the South were often called, to the real intent of the seceders. A change came over the spirit of their dreams. Patriotism, love of the Union, at last came uppermost. They had heard it proposed to divide the old flag, giving a part to each section. They had seen a picture of the emblem thus rent, and it was not a pleasing one. Soon the greater portion of them ceased their sneers and ill wishes, and joined in the general demand that something be done at once to assert the majesty and power of the national government. Even President Lincoln, who in his inaugural address had counseled his countrymen one and all to take time and think calmly and well upon this whole subject, had come to feel that further forbearance was no virtue, and that a decent respect for this great nation and for his office as president demanded that something should be done speedily. So on the 15th of April, he issued a proclamation, calling out 75,000 militia for 3 months to suppress the rebellion, and to cause the laws to be executed. Having been a Massachusetts soldier, it is but natural that I should refer occasionally to her part in the opening of this momentous crisis in the country's history, as being more familiar to me than the record of any other state. Yet proud as I am of her conspicuous services in the early war period, I have no desire to extol them at the expense of Pennsylvania, New York, and Rhode Island. Why so promptly pressed forward and touched elbows with her in this emergency, nor of those other great western states, whose sturdy patriots so promptly crossed Mason and Dixon's line in such serried ranks at the summons of Father Abraham. It has been asked how Massachusetts, so much farther from the national capital than any of the other states, should have been so prompt in coming to its assistance. Let me give some idea of how it happened. In December 1860, Adjutant General Schuyler of that state in his annual report suggested to Governor, afterwards General N.P. Banks, that as events were then occurring which might require that the militia of Massachusetts should be increased in number, It would be well for commanders of companies to forward to headquarters a complete roll of each company, with their names and residence, and that companies not full should be recruited to the limit fixed by law, which was then 101 for infantry. Shortly afterwards, John A. Andrew, now known in history as the Great War Governor of Massachusetts, assumed the duties of his office. He was not only a leading Republican before the war, but an abolitionist as well. He seemed to clearly foresee that the time for threats and arguments had gone by, and that the time for action was at hand. So on the 16th of January, he issued an Order, No. 4, which had for its object to ascertain exactly how many of the officers and men in the militia would hold themselves ready to respond immediately to any call which might be made upon their services by the President. All who were not ready to do so were discharged at once, and their places filled by others. Thus it was that Massachusetts, for the second time in her history, prepared her Minutemen to take the field at a minute's notice. This general order of the governors, although a very wise one as it proved, carried dismay into the ranks of the militia. For there were in Massachusetts, as in other states, very many men who had made valiant and well-disciplined peace soldiers, who, now that one of the real needs of a well-organized militia was upon us, were not at all thirsty for further military glory. But pride stood in the way of their frankness. They were ashamed in this hour of their country's peril to withdraw from the militia, for they feared to face public opinion. Yet there were men who had good and sufficient reasons for declining to pledge themselves for instant military service, at least until there was a more general demand for troops. They were loyal and worthy citizens, and could not in a moment cast aside or turn their back on their business or domestic responsibilities. And in a season of calmer reflection, it would not have been expected of them. But the public pulse was then at fever heat, and reason was having a vacation. General Order No. 4 was, I believe, the first important step taken by the state in preparing for the crisis. The next was the passage of a bill by the legislature, which was approved by the governor April 3rd, appropriating $25,000 for overcoats, blankets, knapsacks, 200,000 ball cartridges, etc., for 2,000 troops. These supplies were soon ready. The militiamen then owned their uniforms, and, as no particular kind was prescribed, no two companies of the same regiment were of necessity uniformed alike. It is only a few years since uniformity of dress has been required of the militia in Massachusetts. But in return to that memorable 15th of April, war, that much talked of, much dreaded calamity, was at last upon us. Could it really be so? We would not believe it, and yet daily happenings forced the unwelcome conclusion upon us. It seemed so strange. We had nothing in our experience to compare it with. True, some of us had dim remembrances of a Mexican war in our early childhood. But as Massachusetts sent only one regiment to that war, and that saw no fighting, and besides did not receive the sympathy and support of the people and the state generally, we only remembered that there was a Scott, and a Taylor, and a Santa Maria, from the colored prints we had seen displayed of these worthies, so that we could only run back in memory to the stories and traditions of the wars of the Revolution and 1812, and which our ancestry had served, for anything like a vivid picture of what was about to occur. And this, of course, was utterly inadequate to do the subject justice. I have already stated that General Order No. 4 carried dismay into many hearts, causing the more timid to withdraw from military service at once. A great many more would have withdrawn at the same time, had they not been restrained by pride and the lingering hope that there would be no war after all. But this very day, the 15th, came Special Order No. 14 from Governor Andrew, ordering the 3rd, 4th, 6th, and 8th regiments to assemble on Boston Common forthwith. This was the final test of the militiamen's actual courage and thirst for glory, and a severe one it proved to many men. For at this 11th hour there was another falling out along the line. But the moment a man's declination for further service was made known, unless his reasons were of the very best, straightway he was hooted at for his cowardice, and for a time his existence was made quite unpleasant in his own immediate neighborhood. If he had been a commissioned officer, his face was likely to appear in an illustrated paper, accompanied by the statement that he had shown the white feather, another term for cowardice. A reference to any file of illustrated papers of those days will show a large number of such persons. Such gratuitous advertising by a generally loyal, though not always discreet press, did some men gross injustice. For, as already intimated, many of the men thus publicly sketched and denounced were among the most worthy and loyal of citizens. A little later than the period of which I am treating, Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote the following poem, hitting off a certain limited class in the community. The Sweet Little Man, dedicated to the stay-at-home Rangers. Now, while our soldiers are fighting our battles, each at his post to do all that he can, down among the rebels and contraband chattels, what are you doing, my sweet little man? All the brave boys under canvas are sleeping, all of them pressing to march with the van, far from the home where their sweethearts are weeping. What are you waiting for, sweet little man? You with the terrible warlike mustache, fit for a colonel or a chief of a clan. You with the waist made for sword belts and sashes. Where are your shoulder straps, sweet little man? Bring him the buttonless garment of woman. Cover his face lest it freckle and tan. Muster the apron, string guards on the common. That is the core for the sweet little man. Give him for escort a file of young misses, each of them armed with a deadly rattan. They shall defend him from laughter and hisses, aimed by low boys at the sweet little man. All the fair maidens about him shall cluster, pluck the white feather from bonnet and fan, make him a plume like a turkey-wing duster. That is the crest for the sweet little man. Oh, but the apron-string guards are the fellows, drilling each day since our trouble began. Handle your walking sticks, shoulder umbrellas. That is the style for the little sweet man. Have we a nation to save? In the first place, saving ourselves is the sensible plan. Surely the spot where there's shooting, the worst place, where I can stand, says the sweet little man. Catch me confiding my person with strangers. Think how the cowardly bull runners ran in the brigade of the stay-at-home Rangers. Marches my corps, says the sweet little man. Such was the staff of the Malakoff takers. Such were the soldiers that scaled the Redan. Truculent housemaids and bloodthirsty Quakers, brave not the wrath of the sweet little man. Yield him the sidewalk, ye nursery maidens. Sauve qui peut, Bridget, and right about, Anne, fierce as a shark in a school of menhadens. See him advancing, the sweet little man. When the red flails of the battlefield's threshers beat out the continent's wheat from its bran, while the wind scatters the chaffy secessiors, what will become of our sweet little man? When the brown soldiers come back from the borders, how will he look while his features they scan? How will lie feel when he gets marching orders, signaled by his lady love, sweet little man? Fear not for him, though the rebels expect him. Life is too precious to shorten its span. Woman her broomstick shall raise to protect him. Will she not fight for the sweet little man? Now then, 9 cheers for the stay-at-home Ranger. Blow the great fish horn and heat the big pan. First in the field that is farthest from danger. Take your white feather plume, sweet little man. The 16th of April was a memorable day in the history of the old Bay State. A day made more uncomfortable by the rain and sleet which were falling with disagreeable consistency. Well do I remember the day, possessing an average amount of the fire and enthusiasm of youth, I had asked my father's consent to go with Company A of the old 4th Regiment, which belonged to my native town, but he would not give ear to any such nonsense, and having been brought up to obey his orders, although of military age 18, I did not enter the service in the first rally. The company did not go with full ranks. There were few that did. Several of my shopmates were in its membership, as those of us who remained gathered at the windows that stormy forenoon to see the company go by. The sight filled us with the most gloomy forebodings. So the troops went forth from the towns and the shore counties of Massachusetts. Most of the companies in the regiment that were called reported for duty at Boston this very 16th, 2 companies from Marblehead being the first to arrive. One of these companies was commanded by Captain Knott V. Martin, who was engaged in slaughtering hogs when Adjutant, now Major General, E.W. Hinks rode up and instructed him to report on Boston Common in the morning. Drawing the knife from the throat of a hog, the captain uttered an exclamation which has passed into history, threw the knife with a light toss to the floor, went immediately and notified his orderly sergeant, and then returned to his butchering. In the morning, he and his company were ready for business. But the relatives who remained at home could not look calmly on the departure of these dear ones, who were going no one knew just where, and would return perhaps never. So, there were many touching scenes witnessed at the various railway stations as the men boarded the trains for Boston. When these Marblehead companies arrived at that city, the enthusiasm was something unprecedented. And as a new detachment appeared in the streets, it was cheered to the echo all along its line of march. The early months of the war were stirring ones for Boston, for not only did the most of the Massachusetts regiments march through her streets en route for the seat of war, but also the troops from Maine and New Hampshire as well, so that a regiment halted for rest on the Common, or marching to the strain of martial music to some railway station, was at times a daily occurrence. It has always seemed to me that the 3 months' men have never received half the credit which the worth of their services to the country deserved. The fact of their having been called out for so short a time, as compared with the troops that came after them, and of their having seen little or no fighting, places them at a disadvantage. But to have so suddenly left all, and gone to the defense of the capital city with no knowledge of what was in store for them, and impelled by no other than the most patriotic of motives, seems to me fully as praiseworthy as to have gone later under the pressure of urgent need, when the full stress of war was upon us, and when its realities were better known, and the inducements to enlist greater in some other respects. There is no doubt whatever but what the prompt appearance of these short-term men not only saved the capital, but it served also to show the rebels that the North at short call could send a large and comparatively well-equipped force into the field, and was ready to back its words by deeds. Furthermore, these soldiers gave the government time to catch its breath, as it were, and, looking the issue squarely in the face, to decide upon some settled plan of action.